Okay, I'll get started fairly promptly since for some of us it's 10 p.m. and 9 p.m. at night. Um, Great. So welcome to everyone. My name is Jessica Valdez. I'm an associate professor of English at the University of Hong Kong, and I will be recording this event and making it available after the event is over. So if you are not able to watch all of it, or if you know someone who's interested, but they live, say, in California and were unable to join, then please do encourage people to watch it later on. Welcome to the second panel of the three-part series about Victorian Studies, Asia and the Pacific. And this panel in particular is called Colonial Past and Presence. Now, I'll briefly kind of mention what my rationale was behind organizing this three-part series, just briefly, because I already talked about it in the first event. But basically, this was organized in light of recent calls to undiscipline Victorian studies and also widen the 19th century. And I wanted to organize this panel in particular to think about, or this series of panels, to think about the relationships between Victorian studies and 19th century studies, and also the study of Asia and the Pacific. So today we have both presenters and participants from across the world, I hope. And I know that many of us are in different time zones. So thank you so much, especially to some of us who are later in the evening, or if anyone braved the early morning, thank you. Also, one reason why I organized this was that I wanted to try to accommodate different groups of time zones so that we could try to have a conversation that is, in a sense, decentered, if you will, from, say, North American time or UK time, although that's never entirely possible, of course. A goal of this was really partly to open up some of these events to the Asian time zones, which are often kind of left out in some of the other events. Before we begin, I want to first thank my postgraduate or graduate student, Shelley Audsley, who's done a lot of the work in setting up the website and designing the posters. She's phenomenal. This event is also hosted by the 19th Century Research Cluster at my university, and of course, under the umbrella of NAVSA, North American Victorian Studies Association. Before I introduce our first speaker, I also want to briefly plug the final event of the series, which will be on May 14th. And you can find more information about that on the website that we've shared with you by email. So I'm going to introduce everyone, but basically I'm going to give you an overview of how this event's going to work. I'm going to proceed in order of the program. What I'll do is introduce each of them before their papers. Since there are 4 presenters, I have asked them to keep their papers to around 8 to 10 minutes in length. Some might go a little bit longer, but that's the general plan. And that means we'll have time for transitions between papers and also for questions at the end. This should leave us, I hope, for around 30 to 40 minutes at the end for Q&A. Which hopefully will involve not just questions, but also comments from our participants, so we can have a proper discussion as opposed to simply kind of a Q&A. And if the presenter is going a little bit over time, I will warn the presenter with a private Zoom text around 8 to 10 minutes, and then ask them to stop at 12 minutes. Please feel free to type any questions or comments in the text chat. I'm asking the participants not to look at the text chat while they're presenting, so they're not kind of distracted, so they're focused on their talk, but I'll keep an eye on the text chat and make sure to bring up any questions later on that perhaps came up during the talks, so that we return to it at the end. Yeah, and of course, at the end of the talk, we'll be open to text questions as well as to audio or video questions. So I'll begin with the first speaker. Our first speaker is Fariha Shaikh, Shaikh, and she is a lecturer in Victorian literature at the University of Birmingham. She's predominantly interested in the wider Victorian or 19th century world, but beyond Britain, and how imperial formations created new conditions for writing. Her first monograph, published by Edinburgh University Press in 2018, is called 19th Century Settler Immigration in British Literature and Art. And in it, she explored the ways in which settler colonialism was supported and underpinned by a prolific outpouring of text, which shaped the geographical imaginations of the mid-century canonical novel. Her next project, provisionally entitled Opium Fictions, From Thomas de Quincey to Amitav Ghosh, charts a literary history of opium. And her talk today is drawn from this project. And her talk today is called Consuming Food, Consuming Opium, Crises, Converged in Timothy Moe and Amitav Ghosh. So I'll hand it over to her, and she can also share her PowerPoint.
Or at least try and share her PowerPoint. And
we can see it.
You can see it? It doesn't have like black all around it or anything?
No, it looks fine.
Okay, cool. All right, thank you very much, Jessica, for that lovely introduction. And thank you so much for putting together such a wonderful series of panels. And thank you all for coming today. I hope the PowerPoint works. If you're not seeing what I think you're seeing, just give me a shout and I'll try and fix it or kind of not be as techie. But this paper today examines the ways in which Timothy Moe and Amitav Ghosh depict the geopolitical importance of opium to the workings of the 19th century British Empire in their novels An Insular Possession and Sea of Poppies. Insular Possession was published in 1986 and Sea of Poppies 2008. Ghosh and Moe's novels are hybrid genres. They can be multiply classified as post-colonial, historical, and neo-Victorian novels. And although the career trajectories of the two authors are divergent, both novels were published to international acclaim and were shortlisted for the Man Booker. In this, they might be said to occupy a canonical status of their own. By focusing on the prehistory of the First Opium War, both Ghosh and Moe's novels subvert their engagement with a long tradition of colonial writing about opium and racialized power relations within the context of empire. In doing so, they present their readers with a fundamentally different aesthetic registration of the relationship between opium, empire, and narrative form. Rather than concentrating on the racialized body and racialized forms of consumption, Ghosh and Moe interrogate the ways in which the opium trade is interconnected with other global commodity food chains through the British Empire. In other words, the novels, I'm arguing, are interested in exploring how the opium trade is linked to other global food chains, but also at the same time, they depict the ways in which the production of opium disrupts existing local forms of consumption as well. And I'm aware that these talks are being recorded, and so I wanted to state from the outset that these are provisional thoughts, and this is more of an attempt on my part to begin to map out and delimit the field of inquiry under question here, rather than provide you with a set of assertions about these two novels. So Moe's novel opens with a description of the Pearl River. The river succors and impedes native and foreigner alike. For centuries, it has fulfilled the functions of road and as rivers will, cloaca. Its appearance changes, if not its uses. Most often, the water is a sullen gray. At its mouth, it stains a clean blue sea, yellow-brown, the color of tea, as drunk in London. Somewhere at its source, the water must run pellucid from some untainted spring, but here in the backlands, the landscape is bleak and sterile, as of a world never properly born. The color of the river here is an eco-critical comment on how the increasing use of the river as a trade route has polluted the water and devastated the surrounding environment. But the simile asserts not only the geographic connection between Britain and China, but as the river is a conduit through which opium is smuggled up into mainland China, an economic one as well. Opium trade in the 19th century was intertwined with that of tea, as well as silks, porcelain, and other luxury items. As the narrator of Mo's novel describes it, when the Chinese start buying opium, quote, "The trickle of opium becomes a torrent such that the terms of trade are irreversibly shifted and the outflows of silver from the empire become enormous." For Mo's narrator, the relationship between opium and tea is a trade triangle. I seem to have missed this quotation from the kind of PowerPoint slide, but I'll just read it out. So the quotation is, "And so the second triangle takes shape. India, the creditor of China through her opium, England in debt to China for the cost of her teas, but then England turns out to be the creditor of India. The company must service its ancient loan from the home government." So in addition to being interconnected, the trade in opium and tea are shown to be part of a larger imperial trade networks. The narrator here refers to the trade as the opium trade, as the second triangle to the first, the slave trade, and makes explicit reference to it. He says, "Who needs unwaged primary producers who still have to be housed, clothed, cured if necessary, and always fed when you have a market of consumers in thrall to your product, to whom you have no responsibilities whatsoever?" So in suggesting that the trade in opium was in part necessitated by the abolition of slavery, Mo demonstrates the ways in which opium is connected to various networks of food commodities distributed throughout empire. In referring to the first trade triangle, the narrator invokes tea's companion, sugar, the popularity of which rose with the popularity of tea. And this is further heightened when the narrator goes on to say that tea goes to comfort and stimulate the poor white cotton workers in the main, so that drug of a kind is at work in all corners of the triangle. Like the mention of the slave trade, the mention of cotton as well shows how the opium trade was interconnected with all of these other economical shifts that empire produced. And in drawing out these distinctions, I'm reminded heavily of Lisa Loh's ideas of imperial intimacies in her book. The rise of British-produced cotton in Lancashire mills saw Indian merchants turning to growing opium instead of cotton to make back some of the loss that British-produced cotton was wrecking on the Indian market. And I'm aware of there's another story to be told there about American cotton that I don't have time to go into yet. So both the trade in tea and the trade in opium are drug economies, albeit of differing levels of addiction. As Carl Trocchi argues, drug economies reorganize capitalist societies, bringing in fundamental shifts in economic power. In depicting the ways in which the two are both intertwined and the ways in which that interconnection is also part of a larger web of imperial commodity relations, an insular possession takes on a larger macro-scale depiction of how the circulation of imperial commodities through global networks are in play with and shift each other. If Mo's novel concentrates its energies on registering how the opium trade through the British Empire is intertwined with other global food trade networks, Ghosh's novel is much more interested in registering the ways in which the circulation of opium through these networks have more local effects on food practices in regional communities. DT, one of the central figures in the novel, pauses to think back to an earlier time in her childhood when all farmers would keep a little bit of their homemade opium for their families. Back then, a few clumps of poppy were enough to provide for a household's needs. Leaving a little over to be sold, no one was inclined to plant more because of all the work it took to grow poppies. And then the narrator goes on to describe the amount of work that's needed. And so with all of this work that's required to grow poppies, what sane person, the narrator asks, would multiply these labors when there are better, more useful crops to grow, like wheat, dal, vegetables? But now those toothsome winter crops were steadily shrinking in acreage. Now the factory's appetite for opium seemed never to be sated. Ghosh draws our attention here to the growth of the poppy as a cash crop. Opium supplants food crops, or the poppy supplants food crops. And we can read this as a reorganization of regional lives and of nature by capitalism. He plays on the notion of satiation, bringing together ideas of hunger, addiction, and capitalist growth to highlight how, as the opium commodity frontier pushes forward, consuming more and more land and labor resources, it has a devastating impact on the local villagers' lives. And I'm drawing here on Jason Moore's work on commodity frontiers. When DT looks at her hut, she observes how it's fallen into a state of disrepair. The hut's roof was urgently in need of repairs, but in this age of flowers, thatch was not easy to come by. In the old days, the fields would be heavy with wheat in the winter, and after the spring harvest, the straw would be used to damage the year before. But now, with the sahibs forcing everyone to grow poppy, no one had thatch to spare. It had to be bought at the market from people who lived in faraway villages, and the expense was such that people put off their repairs as long as they possibly could. So far, I've drawn out the ways in which opium and food are interconnected on global and local levels in these two novels. But I want to end by suggesting that opium does more than just supplant food in an agricultural sense. In Ghosh's novel in particular, I think. Frequently, the lines between drug and food are blurred. DT, for example, shaves off pieces of the hard Bari opium from her husband's chest and places it into her mother-in-law's sweetened milk, sprinkled it onto her achars, kneaded it into her dalpuris, fried it in her pakoras, and dissolved it into her dal. DT packs her husband's midday meals in poppy petals. Darkening as they toasted, the petals began to cling together so that in a minute or two they looked exactly like the round wheat flour rotis that DT had packed for her husband's midday meal. And roti was indeed the name by which these poppy petal wrappers were known. Opium slips between the categories of food and drug, and this slippage I want to end by suggesting might actually be a starting point for positing new ways of thinking about the place of opium in literature. Food is central to the ways in which both novelists articulate how the commodity frontier of opium is intertwined with imperial forms of racialized capitalism. But food is also the constant and ever-present shadow narratives of opium in these novels. While the mainstays of opium literature, the opium smoker or addict and opium dreams, certainly appear in both Mo and Ghosh's novel, the close inextricability of food and opium points to a more expansive way in which you might begin to think about the relationship between the two. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we'll move on to our second speaker. Our second speaker is Chloe Osborne. She is currently an ARC-funded doctoral researcher at Royal Holloway, University of London. Her research investigates the intersections and interplay between anthropological and literary writing about the Pacific in the 19th and 20th centuries, alongside contemporary post-colonial responses. Her work focuses in particular on the authors Robert Louis Stevenson and indigenous Samoan author Albert Wendt, as well as the anthropologists Andrew Lang, Margaret Mead, and Bronislaw Malinowski. Chloe is the chair of the London 19th Century Studies graduate strand run through the Institute of English Studies in London, which brings together PGRs and ECRs working on the long 19th century. In 2021, she will be beginning a visiting research fellowship at the Huntington Library in California, working on a project which examines the Pacific letters, manuscripts, and ephemera of Jack London and the Stevenson family. Congratulations on that fellowship. That's great. And today she'll be speaking on Robert Louis Stevenson, Albert Wendt, and the Romance of Tusitala.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Jessica, and for having me here today. It's such an honour to be included on this panel. At such a sort of, it's quite an early stage of my research. This is very much a kind of work in progress that I'm going to speak about today. So my paper is concerned with how foregrounding contemporary Indigenous writing and critical theory from and about the Pacific allows for decentering of the lingering aesthetic hegemony of 19th century style and form in Victorian travel writing about the region. So it contends that moving towards the kind of recentering of contemporary Indigenous artistic outputs that engage with Victorian era productions can productively work to undiscipline in novel and important ways. And it will sort of consider how, as Victorianists engaging in unbounded reading practices might be a way into destabilizing some of these still present racial logics and economies of the field of VS that Chatterjee, Christoph, and Wong highlighted in their trailblazing article of last summer. Oops. Okay. So Oceania is an especially relevant site to conduct this research for the ways it's kind of typically been imagined by Euro-America in terms of an Edenic paradise replete with noble savages living in a state of nature. And after the death of Cook and the mutiny on the Bounty, the South Seas became, in the words of Rod Edmond, dangerously seductive and anarchic in the Victorian imagination, with the missionary advance in the 19th century presenting the region as an unredeemed world requiring salvation by missionaries and traders. And by the 20th century, Western scholars first had begun to adopt the thesis of fatal impact, which emphasised the fragility and rapid disintegration of Pacific societies when faced with European power, goods, and values. Essentially, the Pacific, especially Polynesia, has been consistently imagined as a repository of Western, often sexual fantasy in representations of it since first contact between Europeans and Pacific Islanders in the 16th century. And this is exemplified by the work of Gauguin in Tahiti in the late 19th century. His painting, The Seed of Aurora, is on the screen here. And contemporary Pacific artists such as Lisa Rehana, whose work is also pictured, have and are undoing, subverting and reconstituting these constructions in brilliant and important ways. For our purposes today, the Pacific is the site of theoretical and methodological exploration in my attempt to explore the triangulations between Victorian and Pacific literary fields by connecting the life and work of two authors writing Samoa, one at the fin de siècle and one writing in the present day. The work of the latter explicitly negotiates the lingering literary legacy of the former, gesturing to his work and his person in multiple moments. So the first of these characters is, of course, Robert Louis Stevenson, who, after travelling through Polynesia and Micronesia, settled in Samoa in 1891 with his family. He purchased a hillside colonial house on Mount Waiyee near the Samoan capital, Apia, which he decked out in the style of a Highland chief and lived there until his death in 1894. During his time in the Pacific, Stevenson penned some of his most well-known stories, including The Master of Ballantrae and Catriona. He also wrote a selection of far lesser-known stories, articles, anthropological writing, and political interventions against German commercial expansion in Samoa. His collection, The Island Nights Entertainments, published in 1893, contains a selection of short stories Stevenson wrote about the Pacific, several of which notably feature predominantly Pacific Island characters. And in these stories and in his nonfiction, Stevenson often articulated a real appreciation of Pacific culture and Polynesian peoples. His story, The Bottle Imp, was specifically penned for a Polynesian readership, which is obviously a kind of huge leap away from how much 19th century travel writing was kind of imagined its potential readership within the communities it was written from. So Albert Wendt was born in 1939 in Apia, Samoa, and his expansive literary and educational career and sustained activism in encouraging new oceanic art has earned him the title as the father of oceanic literature. Emerging indigenous Pacific artists consistently pay tribute to Wendt's life and work in their own work. Wendt's education and cultural upbringing was deeply impacted by the legacy of Stevenson as a sort of literary kind of progenitor of his home island. Wendt was, for instance, amongst a generation of Samoans who were taught to memorise Stevenson's 1887 poem Requiem, part of which was engraved on the poet's tombstone on Mount Waiyee at school. And Stevenson's texts were part of the core curriculum when he attended school and then university. Wendt's writing reveals an extended and often ambivalent engagement with Stevenson's legacy. Across his work, there are multiple references and imaginative connections to Stevenson's Pacific and non-Pacific literature, as well as fictive manifestations of Stevenson himself, notably in The Mango's Kiss, which has a character called Stenson, who's also an ailing author living in Samoa. I will focus briefly on the issue of Tusitala, a word meaning teller of tales or author, in Samoan, as a means of framing quite quickly some of the issues of artistic cross-fertilization between Stevenson's 19th century and Wendt's indigenous literary writing. Stevenson in the Pacific came to be known quite romantically by the moniker Tusitala, and he promoted the idea that this had kind of been proffered to him by the Samoan community, but there is evidence that he was actually first given the title by a visiting missionary while he was kind of visiting a class of children at school in Appiah. In taking up the title, Lloyd Osborne, Stevenson's stepson, wrote that he became, as Tusitala, a great feudal chieftain whose word carried weight in a great part of Samoa, a literary Raja Brook reaching out for empire. This description, which presents Stevenson as Tusitala as presiding over a kind of Samoan Abbotsford, which is how Neil Rennie has described it, Abbotsford being Walter Scott's border retreat, is essentially a sort of colonial patriarch couched in a Scots-Samoan hybrid. And the problematic romance of this self-styling is picked up by Wendt in his seminal novel Leaves of the Banyan Tree, which was published in 1979. This epic novel spans through its 3 books the lives of 3 generations of the family of Tawilo Pepe from the village of Sepepe in Western Samoa, as they struggle to survive in an environment conditioned by waves of European and American colonialism stretching back to the 18th century. Whilst the family patriarch Tawilo Pepe seeks to establish himself amongst the white settler culture in Appiah, in modernising his family estate and bringing his small community of Sepepe closer to Western standards and the Christian church, his son, Pepe, rejects the tokens of a Western-imposed modernity that his father so venerates, seeing these imports as destructive to the traditional spiritual and moral values of pre-contact Samoa. And the second part of the novel is told through the eyes of Pepe and follows this kind of anti-prodigal son as he wreaks havoc upon his father's mercantile legacy in an attempt to undermine his status amongst the white community in the capital. So it's to a moment in book 2 that I wish to very briefly focus on. Pepe, now an adult, married and with a son of his own, has contracted TB, a disease which was imported to the islands in the 19th century and was responsible for killing huge swathes of the population of the Pacific during different outbreaks. It was also, of course, the disease that Stevenson suffered from as a child, the lingering effects of which are thought to have led to his death at the age of 44 in Samoa. Pepe lies in a hospital bed, writing in his diary, and it occurs to him that he would like to write a story. He writes, "I decided to become the second Robert Louis Stevenson, a Tusitala, but with a big difference. I want to write a novel about me." And this is a still from the film Flying Fox and the Freedom Tree, which Wendt adapted into the second book of Leaves. So this was a central section that focuses on the character Pepe. Wendt's gesture at this moment, Stevenson, is highly significant, and the implications of voicing through his ailing protagonist the desire to indigenize the Scottish author is frequently footnoted in critical work on Stevenson. The issue of Tusitala as Stevenson evokes notions of what Mary Louise Pratt has termed the position of the anti-conqueror, that is, the allegedly non-exploitative, white European seeing man, and is unresolved through Wendt's character of Pepe. Wendt, who is himself, of course, a Tusitala, a teller of tales, critically frames the literary hegemony of the Scottish author through Pepe's desire to emulate him. Pepe, who stands against the importation of a Western commodity-laced modernity in Leaves, still necessarily conjures Stevenson as a symbol of Samoan writing, despite the fact that Stevenson embodies the 19th century white colonial adventurer and bringer of civilization, as much as the New Zealand Papalangi, which is the white occupants of Samoa, do in the mid-20th century when the novel is set. So in Leaves, Tusitala appears trifold. It is Stevenson and it is Pepe, but first and foremost, it is Wendt. And the author, I suggest, knowingly plays with this kind of thrice-embodied title. It could be said that Tusitala is Wendt as father, son as Pepe, and Holy Spirit as Stevenson, although those pairings are apt to switch around the more we think about them. As such, I suggest this might be an example of Wendt's ironic and critical representation of colonial Christianity, which is a key theme in the novel, but we might also read a deeper engagement here with the issue of resituating indigenous voices against Victorian textual cultures that preceded them. What does it mean for Wendt and Pepe to write as a Tusitala, a novel about me? So just to conclude, if in Wendt's writing we see the indigenization and reformulation of Stevenson as Tusitala for a sort of native oceanic audience, then I suggest that reading the Victorian author's Pacific writing by way of indigenous later works is not only an angle to understanding his significance, but an essential methodological approach. In texts like Wendt's, which through indigenization of 19th century travel writing enact processes of literary decolonization, they should be essential context for analysis of Victorian writing. And by reading Stevenson's self-styling as Tusitala, by way of the parodic reinterpretation of the Tusitala character by Wendt in Leaves, we foreground indigenous knowledge of Stevenson in these contemporary evaluations of him, placing these interpretations at the forefront of our analysis of Stevenson by his contemporaries and his contemporaries in the Pacific allows us to move beyond the bind of writing back that much post-colonial work has been concerned with towards a new appreciation of contemporary regional knowledge that places Victorian travel writing in expansive contexts that allow for their intangibility as sources of truth about the 19th century and contemporary worlds. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting. And our third speaker is Waiyee Loh. She is an assistant professor of world literature at Kanagawa University in Yokohama, Japan. She received her PhD from the Department of English and Comparative Literary Studies at the University of Warwick. Prior to coming to Japan, she was a visiting scholar at the Department of Japanese Studies at the National University of Singapore, where she conducted the research that forms the basis of today's presentation. Her work has appeared in the journals Textual Practice, Neo-Victorian Studies, Macadamia, and the Journal of Post-Colonial Writing. And today, her talk is called Neo-Victorian Fashion in Singapore, Race and Empires.
Thank you, Jessica, for the opportunity to share my research today. I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Is it working? Okay.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, okay, so I'm going to jump right into it. This paper is drawn from the final chapter of my book manuscript. This chapter examines the subcultural practices of young Singaporean women who dress up in highly stylized Victorian-inspired outfits as followers of Lolita fashion from Japan. Here are some pictures of the women I interviewed in Singapore. This chapter has two main research questions. Firstly, why do these women invest time, effort, and money in performing this highly mediated form of Victorianness? And secondly, how does Singapore's doubly colonial past as a former British and Japanese colony shape the fashion practices of these women? The chapter is based on interviews which I conducted with a small group of Singaporean Lolita fans in 2016 and again in 2019. While the sample size is not representative, my interactions with the interviewees reveal that for this small group of women, their choice of Neo-Victorian fashion is inflected by the development and reification of racial thinking under both British and Japanese colonial rule from the early 19th century to the end of the Asia-Pacific War in 1945. While many scholars have pointed out that racial discourse in Singapore is a product of British colonialism, I argue that it is crucial to recognize that the Japanese occupation also played a significant role in cementing the concept of race in Singapore. While my interviewees profess an admiration for Englishness, their desire for a physical mode of expressing this Englishness draws them towards Japanese Lolita fashion. Because Japanese Lolita fashion is coded as both raceless and racially proximate to so-called East Asian identities, it allows these women to perform a version of Englishness that can accommodate their non-white bodies. By pointing to the racial appeal of contemporary Japanese popular culture, my interviewees suggest that Neo-Victorian fashion in the Singaporean context is shaped by the racial legacies of both British and Japanese imperialism in the long 19th century. In turn, these Neo-Victorian fashion practices of these women reveal the trans-imperial intersections between the British and Japanese empires. By triangulating between Britain, Japan, and Singapore, I seek to unsettle the center-periphery model that is prevalent in both Victorian and post-colonial studies, and to remind us to shift our gaze towards unlikely relations of collaboration between the two imperial powers. In the interest of time, I will focus on the ways in which Japanese colonial rule in Malaya and Singapore intersected with its British precursor to produce, or rather to reproduce, the inhabitants of these two territories as racialized subjects. In other words, as Chinese, Indian, and Malay. In his book, Red Star over Malaya, Chia Boon Keng argues that before the Japanese invaded Malaya in 1941 and Singapore in 1942, there had been interracial tensions, but no major conflicts. Whereas British colonial rule created plural societies in Singapore and Malaya, the Japanese occupation, Chia argues, amplified existing racial tensions into open conflicts that would have a lasting impact on Singapore and Malaya after the war. After the British forces surrendered in Singapore on the 15th of February, 1942, the Japanese military administration in Singapore and Malaya set about governing its newfound colonial subjects by, ironically, adopting and amplifying the race-based policies of the colonial power that it had just ousted. The Japanese continued to treat the Malays favorably while adopting extremely harsh measures against the Chinese population. Like the British before them, the Japanese employed only Malay civil servants, and they allowed the Malay sultans to retain their titles, to receive the same allowances as they had done before the war, and from 1943 to act as official advisors to the Japanese governors. On the other hand, the Japanese military administration severely punished Chinese residents in Singapore and Malaya for supporting the anti-Japanese resistance movement in China. So these vastly differing attitudes towards the Malays and the Chinese led to the Japanese authorities inadvertently causing the two groups to split into two camps that were coterminous with their respective races. So on one hand, the Chinese saw the Malays as pro-Japanese collaborators, and the Malays perceived the Chinese as anti-Japanese resistance guerrillas. In this way, the Japanese occupation deepened each community's consciousness of its racial difference and worsened the latent interracial tensions created by British colonial rule. Having said all this, the Japanese military authorities' decision to maintain the British colonial policy of racial segregation in Malaya and Singapore was not simply due to the exigencies of war. The continued use of race-based organizations to govern the various communities in Malaya and Singapore was part of a larger trend in Japanese imperial discourse. Takashi Fujitani argues that we can see this as a shift from exclusion to inclusion, from vulgar to polite racism. According to Fujitani, the onset of total war in 1937 resulted in Japanese imperialism moving decisively towards a strategy of disavowing racist discrimination and incorporating subordinate populations into a seemingly inclusive, multi-racial nation state and empire. Because total war required Japan to maximize every available human and material resource within its reach, according to Fujitani, the Japanese state had to fashion its colonized peoples into loyal imperial subjects who would willingly commit themselves to Japan's cause. At the same time, discussions of race in Japanese imperial discourse took on a more culturalist form, during this period of time, which was as essentialist and deterministic as earlier biological notions of race. Hanscom and Washburn argue that this culturalist racial ideology was capable of producing difference and hierarchy, while inculcating acquiescence and allegiance to the Japanese Empire through a politics of inclusiveness. In other words, while the Kominka program of intensive assimilation was interpolating inhabitants of colonial Taiwan and Korea as so-called Japanese, these people were at the same time also being interpolated as Koreans, Taiwanese, Chinese, Taiwanese aborigines, and so on. Drawing on this logic of differential inclusion, Pan-Asianist discourse in the 1930s and early 1940s, together with Japanese colonial policy and practice, asserted that Japan's mission as leader of Asia was not so much to meld all races and cultures into an undifferentiated whole, but to combine them in such a way that each race and culture performs its destined role within the cooperative system of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. In Malaya and Singapore, this dual process of assimilation and differentiation formed the ideological context in which the Japanese military administration perpetuated the racial divisions first inscribed by British colonial rule. Like its British precursor, the Japanese military administration made use of ethnic organizations to govern the Chinese, Malay, and Indian communities separately. But it also went much further in reifying these racial categories. For example, by removing the linguistic, clan, and regional distinctions that the British had put in place. For instance, the Japanese dissolved many existing Chinese organizations and instead created the Overseas Chinese Association as the principal agency for dealing with a supposedly homogeneous Chinese community. The Japanese also thought of so-called Chinese character in equally homogenizing terms. They reproduced familiar racial stereotypes often found in British colonial discourse and which had structured the economic division of labor in Malaya and Singapore under British rule. Paul Kratoska cites a 1942 speech delivered by Mr. Mizuno, who was the industrial administrator for Johor. In the speech, Mizuno exhorted his compatriots in Malaya to, I quote, encourage the overseas Chinese to utilize their peculiar economic capabilities in assisting Japan in establishing its new order in Asia. Other contemporary policy documents advise Japanese officials to secure the cooperation of the Chinese in Malaya and Singapore by playing upon their so-called greed for profit and their, I quote, speculative spirit. So these observations of Chineseness function within a broader trans-imperial discourse on race, which makes repeated claims about Chinese business acumen and industriousness. Like the British before them, the Japanese military administration in Malaya and Singapore understood cultural difference in racialized terms, thereby reproducing the racial categories that continue to inform everyday life in the present, including Lolita fashion in Singapore. The idea that the ethnic Chinese in Singapore are racially proximate to the Japanese also has a similarly trans-imperial provenance. Unfortunately, I don't have much time to talk about it today, but if anyone's interested, I'd be happy to talk about this during the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And we're on to our last paper. Our last speaker is Rashna Nicholson. She is an assistant professor of theater studies at the University of Hong Kong. She has published works on colonial and post-colonial South Asian performance, theater historiography, and cultural development. Rashna's first monograph, The Colonial Public and the Parsi Stage, The Making of the Theater of Empire, 1853 to 1893, traces the origins and early development of the colonial South Asian theater. And it just came out, actually, it's available for purchase, I believe now. She is currently working on 2 projects, the influence of the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations on theater in the global South during and after the Cold War, and also the lost theater buildings in Hong Kong. Okay, so I'll hand it over to Rashna.
Thank you, Jessica, for allowing me to present my work in this wonderful panel. And thank you to the previous presenters. I really enjoyed listening to your work. I must warn everyone in advance that I don't have a prepared paper, so you're going to hear a lot of ums and ahs while I'm going through my slides, so I apologize in advance. So this is the cover of the book, The Colonial Public and the Parsi Stage. And like Jessica said, it tells the story of the 19th century South Asian theater, the Parsi theater, which was this incredibly influential pan-Asian theatrical phenomenon that was the precursor not only of numerous modern Asian theaters in places such as Batavia, Singapore, Sri Lanka, but it was also the predecessor of the Indian cinema industry, so Bollywood. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Some of you may not know who the Parsis are. I think Fariha may have spotted the word in Amitav Ghosh's text. But essentially, they're an ethno-religious Indian minority of Iranian origin. They fled from Persia 1,000 years ago and settled on the western coast of India. And they prospered during British colonialism because they were compradors in cotton and opium. They were, that is why Amitav Ghosh has a particularly keen interest in them. And they rapidly, went up the ranks of colonial society. They very quickly became indispensable in occupations such as brokerage, banking, and shipbuilding. But one of the key arguments in my text is that the Parsis were not only compradors in commodities, but also in cultural wares, and especially in the theater. We know that collaborators actuated the rise of port cities and facilitated the development of new forms of consumption, but not much has been sort of written about how compradors, not just the Parsis, even Jewish communities, how they facilitated the transfer of knowledge between different communities. In fact, one of the very popular Parsi surnames, which is Dubash, explicitly references this cultural compradorial role of the community. Dubash meaning do, to, bhasha, language. So it's impossible to do justice to 350 pages in 3 slides, but I'm going to now try to summarize the entire book in 3 slides. So I've divided the theater, the first phase of the theater, into 3 parts. The first part, which is the origins, is the phase of social reform. The theater was part of the social reform movement of the Parsi community. So this was the time when Hindus, Muslims, Parsis, they were all trying to reform their communities and reform their religions. And so the Parsis, they developed newspapers, political associations, libraries in their quest to advance in this path towards morality and virtue and progress and civilization. And the theater was very much part of this mission. So the first plays essentially depicted themes that were written about in the press, which were about the evils of opium and gambling and child marriages and dowry and the need to purify the religion of Hindu and Muslim customs, and so on and so forth. So the theater was essentially a disciplinary mechanism in this first phase. It was part of disciplining the community into colonial norms. Things rapidly changed, however, in the span of about 15 years. Already by the 1860s, theater managers realized that the theater could be quite a profitable enterprise. And so there was several shifts happened during this phase. On the one hand, there was a shift from moral themes, so themes about gambling and the evils of sati and dowries, to spectacle. So for the first time, you have on the Parsi stage, depictions of fairies flying around the stage, monsters coming up through the trapdoors, sparkling water fountains, ships, actresses, sexual depictions of women. And correspondingly, there was a shift in language from Gujarati, which is the language of the Parsi community, to Hindustani, which was much more widely spoken across the Indian subcontinent. And so this was the phase when the Parsi theatre ceased to exist exclusively for the benefit of the Parsi community. And so not uncoincidentally, this was also the period when the theatre began to tour. So it first went from Bombay to Hyderabad, which was a princely kingdom at that time. And then subsequently it went north to North India, South India, and then to East Asia and to Southeast Asia. First to Singapore, and then to Batavia, and subsequently to Burma. The Burmese case especially is very interesting because in the 1880s, King Thibaw Min invited the Victoria Theatrical Company to perform in Mandalay. And he not only built 2 proscenium-based theaters, the first proscenium-based theaters in the region expressly for the Parsis' use, but he also asked the theater managers to go back to Calcutta and to return with magnesium light and ice boxes and European furniture and pianos and billiard tables. And so the theater, began to assume this very influential purpose of not only transporting a ticketed proscenium-based theater to, across the Indian subcontinent and to East Asia, but it also quite literally began to transport commodities to many of these places. But arguably the most famous or the most relevant, influential phase of the theater was the third, which is the period of proto-nationalism. In November 1875, the first Hindu mythological play of the Parsi theatre was staged, which is Harish Chandra. And this was the beginning of hundreds of Hindu mythological plays that then began to be staged across the Indian subcontinent. And this marks the beginning of a very virulent phase of revivalist nationalism, whose conceptual core was a spiritual conjugality. What I mean by that is that the theatre articulated this very complex oppositional vocabulary between the depraved, masculine, Europeanized, westernized self and the pure, indigenous Indian woman that needed to be returned to. And this vocabulary was essentially the first sort of hallmarks of a kind of insurrectionist movement that preceded the official nationalism that would then develop in elite political associations. And so my point really is that the Parsis had not only created this influential pan-Asian theatrical phenomenon that became the precursor to the Indian cinema industry, but it also diffused a very influential and still very active populist political grammar that Indians still have to live with today, unfortunately. And so the Parsis, the chief intermediaries between the rulers and the ruled, had, as I have sort of put down in my PowerPoint, created the space for the development of a network predicated on cultural artifacts of a particular kind. That's it from me. Thank you for your patience. I'll hand back things to Jessica.
Okay, thank you so much for 4 excellent talks that I think have a lot of things to say to each other. I'm going to see if we have any questions. Feel free again to write your questions on the text chat or to ask it out loud if you prefer to do it that way. And of course, panel members are welcome to ask questions as well. Okay, Nina has a question.
Wow, thank you so much for 4 amazing talks. I'm really interested to hear from Waiyee about your interviewee's perception of the historicity of Lolita fashion. Like, how Victorian is it for them? How historical is it for your interviewees? Because I was so interested by your comment that Lolita fashion is racially proximate, but I wonder if it's historically proximate as well, or even ahistorical. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yes, so all the interviewees are aware that Lolita fashion is not historically accurate. So they know that it's a fantasy sort of reimagining of Victorianness. The interesting thing about the interviews was that all of my interviewees were actually interested in the subculture of historical costuming. And some of them also have the technical expertise to sew their own costumes according to historically accurate techniques and using historically accurate materials. But none of them actually wanted to do it. All of them preferred to wear Lolita fashion. So when I tried to press my interviewees for the reasons why they chose to wear Lolita fashion instead of doing historical costuming, they gave me all sorts of reasons. They said that the weather was too hot in Singapore for doing proper historical costuming, or it was too constrictive, etc. But the same things could have been said about Lolita fashion. So I did some focus group interviews, and in those interviews, the girls constantly talked about how difficult it was to wear Lolita fashion in Singapore. And the reasons were almost exactly the same as the reasons for not doing historical costuming. So that's when I realized that race was actually the subtext beneath their motivations for doing for wearing Lolita fashion instead of historical costuming. I'm not sure if it was clear on the photos, but what clear in the photos, one of the girls was wearing the hijab, the headscarf. So she's a Malay Muslim. When she talked about her reasons for doing Lolita fashion, she said that Japanese popular culture in general is raceless, so anyone can participate in it. However, a Chinese interviewee said that when she tried historical costuming once when she was in the UK for the Jane Austen Festival in Bath, someone put her down for being historically inaccurate. And then she mentioned that she feels the same way about Western people wearing Lolita fashion. So that's when I started to think race might actually be one of the unspoken reasons why these girls choose to do Lolita fashion instead of historical costuming.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the question.
I see Lara Atkin has a question.
Thanks, everyone. Wonderful papers. I think just the sort of complexity and multi-layeredness of racial discourses in different colonial spaces came across really, really clearly in all your papers, which was absolutely brilliant. I have questions for Fariha and Chloe, and I'll try and be brief. So for Fariha, I was really kind of interested in your whole kind of reframing of opium in the context of this kind of circulating commodities, commodity frontiers frame. I thought that was great. And I just wanted to ask your thoughts about where literature as commodity comes into this circuit, both as a traveling commodity within the empire, which of course you looked at in your first book, but also the commodification of the post-colonial author. Now, Amitav Ghosh is in some ways a post-colonial author. I'm not sure if Timothy Moe is he not? I don't know. And obviously you mentioned literary prizes, which got me thinking on this. So yeah, that was my question for you. And Chloe, wonderful paper, really making a really strong case for the integration of Indigenous studies frameworks within Victorian studies, and also doing a really fantastic job of it in and of itself. But for perhaps people not as familiar with the methodology, perhaps I'd just like to expand on something that you mentioned towards the end of your paper, which is the way in which, you know, kind of integrating Indigenous knowledge frameworks into and thinking about Indigenous responses to Victorian texts and their legacies differs from sort of post-colonial critique, the act of writing back, as you put it, how it differs. both in the Samoan context and perhaps more broadly for people. You know, what specifically do these localizations and these local knowledges about Stevenson bring that moves beyond post-colonial critique or is different from post-colonial critique?
That's great. As the first question was posed to me, shall I go first, unless you want to go ahead, Chloe, and answer yours?
No, you go ahead, Bria.
That's a brilliant question, Lara, on kind of thinking through literature as commodity and where the commodification of the post-colonial author comes in. And I guess kind of more broadly, it brings up the idea about the literary marketplace and kind of what's happening with the literary marketplace. Part of the reason why I felt it kind of important that I mention the kind of status, if you like, of kind of the novels and the authors is because that seems to me, particularly when thinking about Opium, something that seems to kind of have persisted. So thinking back through the kind of long tradition, if you like, of thinking about opium in literature, there seems to be a certain kind of canonical status when we think about confessions, for example, so De Quincey's Confessions, for example, or Samuel Taylor Coleridge. There's something about kind of literary status and opium consumption that's kind of being embedded there. And on the one hand, I wanted to kind of draw out the ways in which intersecting opium narratives with food narratives might provide us with new ways of thinking about kind of how we might kind of approach representations of opium in literature. But I was also deeply conscious that these are also kind of, you know, novels that kind of have a different kind of literary status or have been accorded a different literary status in their own right. So I felt that kind of that was a necessary kind of thing to signal.
Oh, we can't hear you, Chloe.
Oh, sorry, did I remute myself? Yeah, so thank you, Lara. That's a really good question, and one that I would like to expand on. I think that the critical indigenous framework, as opposed to post-colonial, is relevant and for the kind of epistemic specificity of the Pacific for several reasons. The first is the connection as kind of Alice Dipunga Somerville makes consistently across her work of the contact between Pacific Islanders and the kind of regional hubs of New Zealand and Australia, where settler colonial studies kind of work very tangentially with critical indigenous. I think that there are sort of different nuances of the kind of critical frameworks across post-colonial studies and indigenous studies, in that I guess a very general way of thinking about it is how critical indigenous scholars position themselves in their work and the ways that they recall specific local contexts as means and methods of doing research. So I'm thinking about kind of issues of relationality, the work by people like Laura Tynan on kind of thesis as kin, a very, very specific way of conducting research itself, which is more than just an approach, which I guess post-colonialism could kind of be largely summarized as. I think that the kind of critical indigenous angle for looking at Samoa is it's not necessarily kind of the most obvious, in that Albert Wendt's writing is often considered as post-colonial. But Stevenson, I mean, Samoa was never settled in the same way that New Zealand was, but half of it is still now American Samoa. And there have been settled people there for a long time. And Stevenson, when he arrived in Samoa, found a settled British community, which was part of the reason that he wanted to stay there, was because he kind of had access to people from Europe. So it's a kind of I think the fact that the particular context of him being there, I think, and kind of Wendt's coming from there, and the kinds of regional indigenous knowledge that are brought up in looking at the two kind of comparatively, is different from kind of post-colonial writing back, in that it is a kind of a regional contextualization that really takes account of Stevenson's continuing influence and kind of significance in the islands. So yeah, I hope that sort of answers the question a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot, Chloe.
And then next we have Nicholas Daly, and then after that will be Alex Bubb.
Thanks, Jessica. And thanks to the panelists for 4 terrific papers. Really, really interesting stuff. So I had many questions, but you know, time is short, so I'll try to limit myself to a couple. I had one for Fariha and one for Rashna. So Fariha, I was going to ask about your kind of particular brand of strategic presentism, I suppose, even though I guess at this point the Timothy Moe novel is almost historical itself. I was wondering what drew you to those 2 in particular, and what do you think is at stake for them in picking the 19th century to kind of reactivate at those particular moments. I guess in Timothy Moe's case, it's to do with the Hong Kong Declaration a little bit, because it's close to that, but I don't know about the Ghosh. My question for Rashna was a more sort of pragmatic question, because I know almost nothing about Parsi theatre, and obviously I should buy the book, but in the meantime, maybe you could just say a little bit about the archive that survives of those productions, and I'm just kind of wondering a little bit about what we do. You mentioned special effects and things. I was wondering what kind of survives of our knowledge of those, and where one finds those things out. So
Great, thanks, Nick, for such great questions. So what drew me to both of these novels? I guess kind of I'm still at the beginning of scoping out what I might use for when this eventually, if it ever becomes a book project. And it just seemed to me that that spanning or kind of having a trans-historical project might be kind of one of the ways in which I'm beginning to position the 19th century and kind of the legacies of around the Opium Wars, and that these novels might help me do that. But actually, it's kind of also related, I guess, a little bit to my first project. So kind of Ghosh in an interview, when he's talking about why he kind of writes the Ibis trilogy, he says that he's not interested in opium per se, but that he's interested in migration. And my first project was on migration. And it's that kind of movement that he's tracking between the first and second novels in the trilogy in terms of the movement of indentured laborers from India to Mauritius, that actually kind of what sparks the Ibis trilogy. And so that's kind of one of the reasons why I'm interested in terms of thinking about the mobility of peoples and kind of free and unfree labor, as well as kind of opium as a commodity and as a drug through kind of 19th century British Empire. But the other thing that I think is really interesting about both of these novels is the way in which they engage in particular with the 19th century periodical press. So in Moe's novel, for example, the 2 principal characters leave the company that they're working for. It's an American company that decides to kind of follow the British into the opium trade, and they leave. And a lot of the novel is very, very dense. It's not like Ghosh's novel at all, but a lot of the novel is about kind of how they set up this separate periodical that is an anti-opium kind of periodical and paper. And in Ghosh's novel as well, news and kind of how news travels is so important. So there's like, in addition to kind of the food narratives that's happening there, there's also a really interesting engagement in both of those novels in different ways with 19th century print culture, and a way in which kind of in different ways, both of those novels kind of map the opium wars onto kind of print wars and kind of arguments and disagreements between different kind of the ideological standpoints of these different periodicals as well.
Thanks very much. It's very helpful.
Your question is deceptively complex. Thank you.
Probably accidentally.
I mean, there's a reason why there hasn't been a history of the Parsi theatre so far, a comprehensive archive-based one. And that's because the Parsi theatre has a very long history of a very complex cultural sort of, there's been a lot of infighting within sort of the Indian subcontinent about who can claim sort of the legacy of the Parsi theatre. So Muslims call the theatre the Urdu theatre. Hindus belittle the Muslim and the Parsi contribution, and the Parsis look down on the Hindus and the Muslims. And so that's one whole stream of sort of archival stuff that one has to deal with. But then there's also the cosmopolitan history of the Parsi theater. So there's some scholars who say that you need to look at Hindu sources, Muslim sources, and Parsi sources. The problem with that approach is that, you know, how do you look at a Pan-Asian theatrical phenomenon? How do you study it? From where? You know, I did my archival research in Bombay, Surat, Delhi, Calcutta, London, so the British Library, and New York. But even then, I would say the heart of the book is really Bombay. It's the sources of the Parsi community that are based in Bombay, because these are Parsi Gujarati sources. And so I could track through the newspapers really how the theater originated and developed. So the bulk of my sources are based on this dead 19th century language called Parsi Gujarati, and these newspapers that have pretty much never been looked at before. And the plays I found pretty much everywhere. So Delhi, Bombay, Surat, London, lots of posters at the British Library, but uncatalogued. So, you know, I've lost the number that the librarian gave me to find it again. So who knows whether anyone will find them ever again.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, Alex.
Hi, Rashna. I'm also really fascinated by the Parsi theatre. I've never looked into it, but there's been more than one occasion when I've been looking up something, an old copy of the Times of India, and I've seen some headline, you know, a report of a play at the Grant Road Theatre, and I can't resist having a look at that for 5 minutes. I wanted to ask specifically about the play of Harish Chandra, because that obviously that's a really important theme. Not least because of the theatre, you know, being the subject of the first movie. But I was just thinking about Gandhi. One of the early chapters of the autobiography, Gandhi says that he saw the play of Harish Chandra as a young man, and then absorbed its message of self-discipline and virtue. And I'd always assumed that this was a group of strolling players who came through his part of Saurashtra. And but I don't know, maybe it was actually a touring Parsi dramatic company. I don't know if you have a view on that. It does seem to me that, yeah, there might be some interesting relationship between the dramatic companies based in presidency cities and traditional strolling players, either informing each other. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yes, absolutely. So what you're saying is spot on. There was considerable cross-pollination between indigenous, if I can call it that, performance forms such as the Gujarati Bhavai, the Nautanki, and the Parsi theatre. So it was not just the Parsis taking sort of the London British model of theatre and then transposing it into India. There was a lot of mixing going on within sort of performance genres. But, you know, it was also a money-making thing. So it's very, very likely that Gandhi actually saw a Parsi theatre troupe, because the economics of the stage were such that there were just hundreds of Parsi theatre troupes by possibly when he was a boy. They even traveled to East Africa. So he must have seen that was the dominant form of entertainment at the time. So he would have seen some Parsi theatre plays. And I can see how he would draw something from Harish Chandra, because the play is all about this concept called dharma, which is, you know, a set of rules, Hindu norms, rules that Indians should begin to start aspiring towards, rather than sort of the Victorian moral norms that had been imposed prior. So yes, it's really fascinating that you saw advertisements of the Grant Road Theatre. Yeah, oh. That's interesting.
Yeah. Reviews do appear sometimes in Times of India, in the English language press.
Yeah.
So Chloe says she has a question.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. I have a question for Fariha. I was really interested by what you said about Ghosh's novel and the way it registers kind of local effects of changes in circulation in a much more sort of specific way than Mo's novel, which looks much more at these kind of broader trends. And I recently found out that Ghosh is a trained social anthropologist, and a lot of my work is looking at the kind of overlaps and intersections between anthropological and sort of ethnographic and literary writing. And I was wondering if you read that at all in his focus on this local kind of very specific contextual framing, if that's something that you've thought about at all when thinking about that novel. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I think I'm kind of echoing what people have said before when I kind of talk about kind of Ghosh's real kind of attention to detail and kind of historical detail in the delineation of his characters. So I think kind of what's really interesting is not just the historical accuracy of the novels, but also, and not just the kind of the detail of the characters, and I think people have written about this before, but how that kind of attention to detail kind of seeps through to shape the very language of his novels, and the way in which that kind of linguistic hybridity is really kind of pulled out and really well done. But that's a really interesting question. I don't think I'm saying kind of anything that kind of other people haven't said before in that respect.
Okay, we have an anonymous question for Rashna. Someone asked someone was curious about when the tradition of Parsi theater ended and how did it exist in the diaspora? And the person also asked if there's any continuities between Parsi theater and Freddie Mercury.
Well, to answer the first question was about when it ended, right?
Yes.
Sorry.
And also, how did it exist in the diaspora?
So it ended, the mainstream Parsi theater ended with cinema. So all the personnel, the actors, the managers, the finance, it all went into the cinema industry. So if you look at the early films, they're basically Parsi theater. That's what it is. And this is a very big caveat, there were various sort of smaller forms of Parsi theater that did develop after sort of the advent of cinema. So you have the company Natak in South India, you have an insular variety for the Parsi community. They survived in many different forms, but most of sort of the energy, the financial capital, the sort of personnel, it all went into cinema. Within the diaspora in Indonesia, you had a form called Komedi Istanbul that came from the Parsi theater. You also have the Bangsawan that was inspired by the Parsi theater. In Sri Lanka, you had the Nurti theater that was inspired by Parsi theater. So lots of indigenous forms cropped up that were imitation Parsi theater, so inspired by the Parsi theater. Freddie Mercury, the theater did go to East Africa at some point, but who knows? I mean, I don't know if there's some lineage there. I don't know. I haven't looked into Freddie Mercury's family background, but I'm sure his parents saw some Parsi theater. If not him, yeah.
And then we have another question for Rashna in the text chat. Can you tell us more about the cultural compradors concept? I wonder if it could be used for Latin America in the context of the 19th century British informal empire.
Definitely. So one of the projects that I'm thinking about, I haven't started working on, is the Jewish community in Hong Kong, and how quite a number of, well, I don't want to say a number of them because I haven't done a lot of research, but a few very influential ones set up cinemas here. So that's something that I'm starting to look into. And so I think, in that respect, even sort of Jewish communities in India, in Hong Kong, they were assuming very similar roles, I think. The Parsis were called the Jews of India. So, you know, I think in that sense, there was a lot of overlap. And I think similar case could be made also in Latin America, I think.
And I think we have a second question from Alex.
Oh, I only want to come in if no one else wants to ask.
I think we have time, and then we have one other text question.
Okay, then, yeah. Chloe, would you like to say any more about the dual publication of the Bottle Imp? So, as you mentioned, yeah, the significance that it is also published in Samoa, and if I'm right, I think that was a missionary publication. So some missionary who translated it for Stevenson. I wonder if you know any more about the context, you know, whether Stevenson was involved in the decision-making process, you know, or whether, you know, there's a risk of exaggerating the significance of it too much.
I think I'm not actually sure about. I think he possibly died before the publication of it, or before he had kind of cited the publication of it in the missionary magazine in Samoan. I found one reference to this and no others so far in my research, that he was also involved in the actual development of the Samoan written language. It's a claim made by Carlo Ginzburg in a book on kind of translation and the 19th century. But I haven't found this repeated anywhere. So I'm sort of, it's kind of on my to-do list to look into more. But if that is the case, I mean, that's fascinating information that he was actually involved in this kind of the sort of Romanization, I guess, of the language. I'm not sure about how much he actually had to do with the translation of the Bottle Imp. The majority of what I've read about it is the significance of the fact that he actually did write this with a kind of Polynesian audience in mind. And it's been suggested, Lucio De Capitani's written an article about this, calling it an example of born translated story writing, in that it's Stevenson's kind of interest in the story. It's sort of developing kind of a legend of sort of Samoan legend anyway, and he was extremely interested in folklore and kind of mythology. So his writing this in the first instance might have been because he was inspired by local legend or characters. So in a sense, the writing it then for a Polynesian audience is a kind of evolution of something that came from the land anyway. So that the majority, most of what I've read has kind of been about the significance of his developing this as a kind of concept, less about the publication itself. But it's certainly an area I need to look into more, because it's really fascinating.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Do you see that at the start? That born translation genesis? Do you think he's doing something? Because it starts in San Francisco, doesn't it? The hero is walking on Nob Hill. So is Stevenson doing something to make that legible to a Samoan audience? You know, we're starting in this faraway city, but now we're going to come to the Pacific. Yeah,
and San Francisco is, of course, the city that he sailed from to reach the Pacific Islands. So there's a sort of suggestion that he's possibly kind of inserting himself in a way into that into the story and kind of as I say, kind of evolving it for multiple audiences with multiple readerships in mind, with different kind of specific regional knowledges as well. So there's quite a lot of that kind of sort of distancing and moving between different contexts going on, I think.
Okay, we have time for one final question. Does anyone else have a question that they want to ask before some of us go to bed and the rest of us have afternoon tea? And some of us maybe have breakfast. Oh, yes, I hear a question. Who's speaking?
It's me. I have a question for Fariha. It's so interesting, this sort of link between drug commodities and food commodities. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the effect of opium on the body, and that quote about tea bringing comfort to the body of these cotton workers, and the difference between, food as nourishment and the sort of wasting effects on opium. Is that a thread that you've seen coming out in your research? Thanks. Fariha, you're muted.
Now I'm unmuted. You really would think a year in that I've learned this. So what I was saying is, thanks for asking this, because I didn't get a chance to, I kind of touched on it at the end, but I didn't get a chance to kind of expand upon it. But at the end, when I was talking about this blurring between opium as kind of, this kind of occupying this slippery kind of space between food and drug, is something that happens kind of both historically when you're looking at 19th century kind of texts, and something that I think Ghosh in particular picks up on. And so kind of the quote that you mentioned, Nina, about tea providing comfort, opium does as well, both historically kind of in various, you know, archival texts, and in the novels as well, because opium, like the laborers who are out kind of harvesting the opium, frequently kind of take opium just to relieve bodily pains that kind of come about as a result of producing opium. But then there are also other ways in which the distinctions between kind of opium as drug and food is elided and blurred. What was the second part of the question that you asked? The first one was whether or not it, oh, so the second part of your question was kind of, is the only narrative about kind of consuming opium about the body wasting away?
Yeah.
So I think Javed Majid writes about this. He's got a brilliant article on De Quincey, Gandhi and Tali out in Literature and History, and there's a section in which he's talking about opium and food and the ways in which kind of eating opium has a longer history than the 19th century of being eaten in India, and how kind of there are various arguments that in the 19th century are made for eating opium, because it's supposed to kind of aid digestion, and kind of it's supposed to be really good for a vegetarian diet. And so I think something that I didn't kind of get on to kind of explore fully was the ways in which that elision of opium as food and drug is something that's really, really slippery and interesting and plays out in kind of these really kind of complex competing ways.
Thank you.
Okay, well, that is the end of our hour and a half. Thank you so much to our presenters for 4 really wonderful papers. And thank you for everyone coming and for asking questions. And again, the next event, the last one, is on May 13th. And if you've registered, I'll be sending around more details closer to that date. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Goodbye, the awkward Zoom wave.
Thanks so much, Jessica.
Thank you for organizing this.
Thank you.